Who would have thought that if 30 talented developers from France, fed up with the current state of the industry, come together to form a new game studio, that they are capable of producing a game that is able to compete with AAA blockbusters on every level? Most people, me included, would at least be skeptical. And when I saw the first trailer for Clair Obscur Expedition 33, with its beautiful Unreal Engine 5 visuals, my first impression was that it looks way too good to be true. But as it turns out, this game actually looks this ridiculously good. From the moment we get introduced to Gustave throwing rocks at the painters, we are invited to observe Lumiere's impressive architecture and surrounding areas. And Clair Obscur is not only impressive on a surface level, even the facial or movement animations in general are top tier. By the way, have you ever wondered why the game is called Clair Obscur and why that is such a fitting name? That is because Clair Obscur is the French translation for chiaroscuro, an art style often used in paintings but also in filmmaking or photography that describes the usage of strong contrast between light and darkness to create depth inside sceneries. And if you have experienced it in its entirety, you know how perfectly that name fits for this game. Anyway, visuals are not the only thing that will make you stop to take some time to fully take it in. For one, you have the voice acting. And if you have seen some of my older videos like my Unicorn Overlord review for example, another great game by the way, you know how much I appreciate good voice acting, and Clair Obscur is no exception. And Sandfall Interactive got themselves some heavy hitters, like Jennifer English, the voice for Shadowheart in Baldur's Gate 3, Asmael, or Charlie Cox, who recently played Daredevil in the MCU to play Gustave, just to name a few. But all that aside, what really pushed me over the edge to get goosebumps in one of the final fights in the game was the music. And let me tell you, there's good music, and then there is music that is so good that you catch yourself humming the rhythm while doing your laundry. And you know what makes it even more ridiculous? The studio apparently randomly found the composer on SoundCloud before working together on the soundtrack. But enough gushing over the French, because just walking around and gazing at the sceneries would not make a very good game. So let's take a look at the actual gameplay. One of Clair Obscur's biggest aspects is the emphasis to make the player explore, and they give the player many incentives in form of different types of loot around every corner. Further, besides the overworld map, you have no map. To find your way around the areas and dungeons, you will have to explore. Which on one hand is quite refreshing, and they even countered the golden path problem with marking the main path in light and leaving optional paths in the dark, which again fits the concept of Clair Obscur perfectly. But I have to say that on the other hand, not having a map is quite demotivating when you try to find characters for a quest in the post-game. And I myself don't feel like going back for any side quests I missed as of now, despite really loving the main aspect of this game, which is the combat. And there's quite a handful to look at here. First of all, you can easily tell that the developers took great inspiration from the Persona series here, with how the menus look and how the characters change their stance when you select an action, and they actually surpassed their inspiration with how they implemented the firearms, by letting the player freely aim at weak spots for extra damage. But you also can't just shoot a certain amount of times each combat encounter. Instead, like any offensive move aside from the basic attack, to take a shot consumes AP. So you have to weigh up if you want to take the risk of taking a shot and maybe not be able to use a move because you lack the right amount of AP. But let's just take a quick step back here, because before going into combat there are several things to do. First, there is your equipment, which comes down to a character's weapon and some cosmetics. But while that sounds quite irrelevant, don't let yourself be fooled. Because the right or wrong choice of weapon and its element can make the difference between dealing massive damage or having a character healing your opponents with their attacks. And while there is no classic armor or stat-altering relics to equip, those are replaced by so-called pictos. That can be such powerful upgrades that I felt like leveling up and upgrading certain stats was kind of irrelevant when you can just double your defense with one of 3 pictos each character can equip. And not only that, each picto also contains a passive effect called Lumiere that can range from stuff like more damage for an element to gaining additional AP every turn. And those Lumieres can be assigned to every character after having a party member take part in a few encounters with a specific picto equipped, with the help of Lumiere points even without them having the picto equipped themselves. And if you're like me and completely overlook this option in the menu, you will unintentionally make your playthrough much harder for a while. Coming back to the actual combat, here you have the option to skip a turn, use an item, shoot, use a basic attack or an ability. And later in the game, you will unlock these so-called gradient attacks that are much more powerful and only usable if a bar at the bottom of the screen is filled. Skipping a turn is pretty self-explaining, and I already told you how shooting works. So let's begin with using items. The items you can use are very limited. One to fill up some HP, one to gain some AP, and one to revive a squad member. and one that can only be used outside of combat that can heal your entire party. The quantity of these potions can be increased by finding so-called tin shards in dungeons or on the overworld map. But you will never have to buy any. Instead, they are replenished at checkpoints similar to the Souls games where you can save, heal or upgrade your characters. When performing a basic attack, the character uses their weapon to strike an opponent and gains 1 AP afterwards. When you perform an action on the other hand, you will be met with a huge variety of moves to choose from, all with beautiful animations. That can, turn-based RPG typical, be divided into 3 categories: physical, magical and support. And while this would be enough for most turn-based RPGs, even from beloved franchises like Persona or Pokemon for example, Sandfall expanded on that formula. For one, with giving every party member something completely unique just for them, like the stances for Moelle that will change their damage output or defense, or Gustav's robotic arm that can release a very strong charge attack after a while, just to name a few from the early game, so I don't spoil what is to come. And let me tell you, it gets much more creative than that. On top of that, for almost every move you will have to perform a quick time event, that if hit perfectly strengthens the attack or in some cases grants bonus effects, but if failed can drastically decrease the effects or in some cases even backfire. And this is only the beginning of the active part, and the actual challenging part begins when your opponent has a turn. Because when an opponent attacks, you have the option to dodge, parry or jump if they do a ground attack, which is indicated by a golden symbol growing before the impact. And you will definitely have to take advantage of that, because not only do successful parries grant additional AP and parrying all attacks in an opponent's turn trigger devastating counterattack, if you not at least dodge, even simple enemies, especially later in the game, will have no problem wiping the board with you at least on normal difficulty. And if your opponent performs a gradient attack, you will have to perform a gradient counter, and if you miss those, in some cases, this can easily be a game over alone. And I must say that I really like that approach, because that feeling if you perfectly counter every attack and get that counter attack is very satisfying. But on the other hand, I often had to at least die once to stronger enemies to learn their attack patterns, because of how often they delay their attacks and try to get you to parry too early. But that wasn't too frustrating, because you can very quickly get back to try again every time, and in the end it feels more satisfying when you eventually defeat a boss and get that beautiful cutscene afterwards. Speaking of cutscenes, those are obviously containing a lot of the plot, and before coming to the game's story, I want to give you the chance to skip to the timestamps shown on the screen right now. So with that out of the way, the game begins, as mentioned before, with Gustav staring at the sceneries around Lumiere before being picked up by Moelle. You then already get to control Gustav for the very first time and are tasked with picking up a rose and following Moelle. And from that moment on, despite the jaw-dropping beautiful surroundings, the game already manages to create a depressing atmosphere that implies something terrible is about to happen. Moelle notices Gustav's gloomy expression and challenges him to a duel, which acts as a first combat tutorial. After finishing their duel, the two are about to meet up with Gustav's former girlfriend before joining the festival at the day of the so-called gommage. Gustav and Sophie, who already has a lot of flowers around her neck, more or less try to talk, but the atmosphere is too heavy to really call it a conversation. Finally, Gustav places his rose on Sophie's flower necklace as well, and the two begin to make their way through the festival and towards the Lumiere harbor. On their way, they come across a lot of happy faces enjoying the festivities, but on the second look, the happiness is only on the surface. You find a grieving florist that tells you there is less and less people to buy their flowers. Further, you will see members of the Expedition 33 playing guitar or saying goodbye to their loved ones and friends. As they reach the end of the festival and the sun begins to go down, by the way, you should walk to the right before ending the festival to challenge the mime for your first minor optional boss fight. We now get to witness the so-called paintress rise in front of her monolith and erase the number 34. And with that, a gut-wrenching scene begins to play out as the so-called gommage, which is French and translates to erase, dissolves everyone who is 34 years old. With the terrible highlight being the final goodbye between Sophie and Gustav, as his former partner also falls victim to the paintress's curse. Setting one hell of a tone for the game and giving some pretty obvious reasons as to why the expedition tries to stop the paintress every year. When things settle down a bit in the evening, the members of the expedition, including Gustav and Moelle, come together to drink and bond before their attempt at stopping the gommage, like 67 expeditions did before them. Here, you also have the option to earn and spend tokens to get an old key, a haircut or a picto. After fighting Moelle once again, Gustav's sister Emma begins to give a final motivational speech and the expedition leaves Lumiere by ship, ending the prologue. When Expedition 33 arrives at their destination and leaves the ship, they are met by an older man wearing expedition clothes. But before the leader of our expedition can even finish his questions, the old man beheads him and chaos breaks out as we see people vanish left and right, which comes to an end with Gustave being attacked by a bright creature with 2 huge hands. When he regains consciousness and finds himself alone without any orientation, he immediately begins looking for other survivors. But when all he can find is death, and he ultimately arrives at a huge pile of former expeditioners, Gustave is overwhelmed by his emotions. He then sits down next to what were once his brothers and sisters, and aims his weapon at his own head, but before he could commit the Kurt Cobain homage, Luna arrives and manages to bring him back to his senses. The 2 of them then begin to make their way through the spring meadows together until they come across an enemy that lacks all color of his normal design, sitting next to the records of a former expedition. The so-called Jar then begins to speak to them, telling the duo that he needs light. You can then find something to light his lamp, and after it burns for a short while, he begins to talk a little bit about the paintress, but that's just a side note. The 2 continue their journey until they arrive at the so-called Indigo Tree. Here they have to fight the first major boss, where after defeating him they find a message telling them that Mel has been taken somewhere. Even though Luna feels like the message is clearly a trap, Gustave insists on looking for her. After leaving Spring Meadows, we get to traverse the overworld map for the first time, where the 2 immediately head for the Flying Waters. The Flying Waters are actually one of my favorite regions in the game, because as the name suggests, you are traversing an underwater world with sunken shipwrecks, sea mines or sea life like fish or whales in the sky, without there actually being water, so you just move around normally and don't have to swim or anything. After traversing for a while, Luna and Gustave come across a hut with a big door. When you are closer, a cutscene triggers and the 2 are transported into a huge mansion. Inside the mansion, there's almost nothing to find, but after running into one closed door after another, you come across a room with an open door. And in there, at the desk, sits Mel. After a hearty reunion, the now trio heads for the entrance to continue their expedition. But right at the door, the so-called curator, a faceless human-shaped being, blocks their path and challenges them to a battle. After overcoming the challenge, he joins the expedition at the camp and is now acting as their upgrade hub to improve their equipment. Upon leaving the mansion, the 3 come across the merchant Noko that introduces us to the concept of merchants, where you not only can buy upgrade resources, cosmetics or equipment like weapons or pictos, but also have the option to duel them to unlock quote-unquote better stuff to buy. Following this encounter, the growing group takes their leave and begins to further explore the depths of the Flying Waters. At the end of this region, they come across another boss called Go Blue. Upon defeating said boss, a cutscene triggers showing Mael having a vision of people that look like they are responsible for killing most of their comrades at the very beginning of their journey. Afterwards, the 3 are back at the camp enjoying a well-deserved moment of rest. But the next day eventually comes and Luna, Mael and Gustave are headed for their next destination, the Ancient Sanctuary, where you will come across warriors of the so-called Jestrels, creatures that look like wooden dolls and can grow massively as they age. But after proving themselves by fighting the Jestrel's strongest warriors, they then head for the chief's house in order to ask them for informations and for help to cross the sea. The chief Gora informs them that the white-haired men that destroyed their troop also attacked the village, and that their best way to cross the sea would be to ask Eskir for help. But in order to be able to meet Eskir, they will require a password, which they of course not give to everyone. So the group is tasked with taking part in the legendary tournament to prove themselves. So without any other choice, the group prepares to take part in the tournament, and to do so they will have to select one of their members to face several opponents in a one-on-one battle. But be careful who you choose here, because that character will receive a strong weapon as a reward in the end, and I heard that Mael is the best option to pick here. But to be honest, I did not pick her because I didn't know back then, and I still found her to be a very effective party member. As you fight your way through the ranks, you then have to face the final boss eventually, who turns out to be another member of Expedition 33, a woman by the name of Ciel. Following her defeat in the final, she joins our squad and we get back to the chief, who tells us that the password for Eskiel's nest is to very loudly shout to get out of my way. Back at the camp, it is time to rest again and we witness another flashback cutscene with the white-haired old man. With newfound strength, the group immediately makes their way towards Eskir's nest, where they are met by a Jestrel guard that demands a password from them to enter. Gustave is chosen to be the one to shout, to which the guard reacts shocked and moves out of the way. Inside the cave we finally get to meet the best side character of the game, the comic relief and soft giant Eskir.
Whee! So the whee balances the...
You might say you're a bit, wee-woo then.
You really get me, Verso.
I'm a bit, wee-woo myself.
He agrees to help the quartet under the condition that they reclaim one of his beloved stones from his friend and neighbor Francois. Inside Francois' cave, the stone turtle creature will get annoyed by the group for demanding the stone back, and an interesting boss fight begins. After defeating Francois, he will grumpily return the stone, and Fleury can finally return to its rightful owner. Back at Esquier, he will reveal that the stone Francois gave us was in fact not the real Fleury, and that we now have to look for that at the Stonewall Cliffs. Without any major events, they make their way through the Stonewall Cliffs, fighting many enemies along the way, only to find another boss fight at the end. This time against the so-called Lampmaster, and this is the actually first tough one in my opinion, due to him having two phases. Defeat him and we finally find the real stone for Esquier. But as the expeditioners are about to leave, the white-haired man arrives, trapping Maël and challenging Gustave to a fight. But the chanceless Gustave can only sacrifice himself to protect Maël for a while, which was just enough time for another mysterious man to arrive who seemingly has the power to fight Renoir on equal footing. Thanks to him, Maël isn't harmed and the group manages to flee. Devastated by their loss, the expedition, but especially Maël, who lost the closest thing to a family she had left, came together at the camp grieving in silence. The mysterious man that saved Maël from Renoir, called Verso, feels responsible for Gustave's death because he was only a few moments too late. As a sign of compassion, he offers to bring the allies to a place where they can bury Gustave and pay their respect. But to get there, the now newly assembled quartet has to cross the so-called Forgotten Battlefield, an area full of trenches resembling those of the World War era, and paved with destruction, fires and the remains of Nevrons and Gestrels. But their trip through the battlegrounds is more or less without any major incidents, until they reach a huge stone bridge. While crossing said bridge, they are ambushed by a boss called the Duelist, who causes them to fall into a pit of blood. Here, one of my favorite boss fights takes place. I just really liked the combination of music, scenery and attack pattern in this fight, and found it very satisfying when he finally went down. And on top of that, the reward for bringing the Duelist to his knees is an emotional cutscene where his friends and comrades can pay their respect one last time by burying Gustave at a beautifully lit place beneath a red leaf tree, again playing with lightning, making it almost look like a Clair Obscur style painting itself. Afterwards, Verso suggests to go to Monoko Station, where they find another possible ally, the shape-shifting Gestrel Monoko that loves fighting. The group also has to fight Monoko, who seems to be not that fond of seeing his old friend again. But after defeating and convincing him by telling him that there is going to be a lot of fights he will take part in if he joins, Monoko happily does just that. The now quintet then decides that Haute Lumière is going to be their next destination, which Monoko once again is not too fond of. Which is due to the reason that Expedition 33 is not the first expedition they accompanied to Haute Lumière, and the former ones did not experience a happy ending there. When they arrive at Haute Lumière, the party gets divided and the two groups are forced to traverse the empty streets of this former city, isolated from one another. Upon reaching the gates of an old mansion, Expedition 33 is finally reunited, but also has to face a not so welcoming reunion, as, upon wanting to enter the mansion, they are once again faced by Renoir, who reveals that Verso is his son before challenging the squad once again. And when Verso once again saves Maël, she finds herself in a black and white scene similar to her visions where only she can move. Afterwards, the mansion disappears and Verso is confronted by his allies about his past and his family circumstances when they regroup at the camp. When the mood has calmed down, the party comes up with a plan to kill two so-called Axons to gain enough chroma so that the curator, the faceless upgrade dude, can create a weapon strong enough to pierce a barrier that protects the paintress from anyone trying to get close to her. And here you are advised by Verso to first go to the Visage, simply because apparently it is supposed to be the easier fight. Me, completely mishearing his advice, obviously went for the wrong one first. But if I'm being honest, I haven't noticed any difference in difficulty between the two. Anyway, in the Visage area you will be greeted by a grim-looking creature that tells us that the Axon is expecting us and invites us to directly go there. If you follow the other paths around, you get the opportunity to fight 3 emotion masks, one for happiness, one for sadness and one for anger. If you defeat them, the actual boss fight will be easier, so I absolutely recommend doing that. When you then head on to defeat the actual Axon, the servant from the beginning reveals himself as the final boss of the area, the Masked Keeper. Upon defeating it, the quintet takes the huge amount of chroma and heads back to the camp to prepare for the second Axon. The area of the Siren Axon resembles a huge opera house you will have to traverse before being able to challenge its final boss. Along the way you will come across a huge creature weaving in a corner called the Tissuer. It is not hostile and the party debates over if you should leave it in peace. But Verso suggests to defeat it in order to weaken the Axon, and like in the last area I recommend doing so here as well. Afterwards the group heads for the Siren's place of stay, and we get a cutscene that shows the Axon messing with the expeditioners' minds. And after overcoming the second challenge, Expedition 33 can now bring back the chroma to the camp where the weapon will be crafted. Following that, it is time to finally head for the Paintress's monolith. Mael, with the help of the barrier breaker sword, cuts through the barrier, and now it's time to confront the Paintress. But something seems off, because no matter what you do, the Paintress doesn't take any damage, and does not act herself. The battle then transitions back into a cutscene where Mael approaches the Paintress and has another flashback where she sees the masked woman that she saw a few times already. Following that, everyone except Verso begins to burn and squirm in pain, but that seemingly happens to be another illusion, which is followed by the expedition gaining access to the inside of the monolith. Inside, the group crosses almost every type of scenery they came across throughout their journey, and occasionally a black and white scene will play showing off some flashbacks from the masked woman's life. At the end of their journey through the monolith, they find a train station where Gestrel offers them to bring them to Lumiere. Leaving the train, the quintet finds a Lumiere without any humans, but overrun with Nevrons instead. They fight their way through until they reach a massive area with huge paintings on the side, which seems to be the final place just before the actual Paintress. But before the group can enter a realm, Renoir once again gets in their way, firmly determined to stop them once and for all. One of the toughest boss fights begins, and the party really has to give it their all to overcome Renoir's final stand. Afterwards, the group passes through the portal and finally actually faces the Paintress. At the moment the music kicks in, this fight was the one that actually gave me goosebumps. With its combination of scenery, story progression and audio design, it was just epic. However, after this, in my opinion, less challenging two-faced boss fight, the curse of the Gommage seems to finally have been lifted. And Expedition 33 cheeringly places their own expedition flag at the top of the monolith before heading back to Lumiere, where they are to be celebrated as heroes. But while everyone else was partying, Verso is seen reading a letter that he was supposed to give to Mael. That explains that the Paintress was the creator of the entire world they live in and erased people every year because their ability to stabilize this world was fading. After Verso throws the letter into the harbor, an explosion appears out of nowhere, erasing everyone in Lumiere like if they would fall victim to the Gommage. We then enter the Manor epilogue, where we wake up in the mansion as Alicia, the masked woman and Verso's sister. She is being called by a voice that asks her to come to the family atelier. When she arrives, there she will be greeted by her sister Claire. And here we get a huge lore dump. Apparently Alicia, Claire, Verso, the Paintress and Renoir are part of the Descendre family. The Descendre family are a family of so-called painters that have the ability to create worlds by painting them on canvases. Also, seemingly, the so-called writers are responsible for a fire that killed Verso and heavily injured Alicia, causing her to lose her voice. Her parents making her responsible for her brother's death further adds to Alicia's misery. In her grief, Alicia's mother created a canvas that includes a living version of Verso, which is the world the game took place in so far. Renoir, who doesn't want his wife to lose herself in this fake world, joins her as well. Further, when Alicia joined her parents, she got reborn as Mael in her mother's fake world. After this lot of information, Alicia, who also misses her brother a lot, wants to go back into the canvas. Claire tries to talk her out of it, but it is no use. Back inside, Mael has now unlocked the power of the painters, which means if she gets hold of enough chroma, she can repaint anyone that fell victim to the Gommage. With her fake brother and her fellow repainted expedition members, she then begins to traverse Lumiere once again. Passing through an opera house, the Lumiere garden and finally coming to a place with an eclipse in the background that once again looks like a painting in the Clair Obscur style. Here, Mael will be confronted by her father, who reveals himself to be the curator, and has once again have to be defeated. After that, the scene changes to Verso, who walks towards a boy who paints on a canvas. Here you have to decide if you want to fight as Mael or as Verso. Your decisions will result into two different endings. If you fight as Verso and defeat Mael, you will get the Life to Love ending, where the canvas world would cease to exist. We will see Alicia and her family at Verso's grave, and the characters from our journey through the canvas would wave at us one last time. If you take the other route and fight as Mael, which is what I did, the canvas won't be destroyed and we get another black and white scene. Here we can see everyone being repainted, including people we never saw before, like CL's husband. They all come together at an opera house, I would assume, where Verso, who looks very uncomfortable, almost like being forced to be here against his will, who sits in front of a piano and is about to perform. The camera then switches to a close-up of Mael, and her face begins to become more and more distorted until the game ends. And no matter what ending you took, to me that was a perfect ending for a hell of a rollercoaster of a game, and I hope you get more in this universe, and get answers to things like who the writers are, what Claire did all the time, and if there are other painters and so on. If you played the game yourself, feel free to share your opinion on Clair Obscur's plot in the comments. So, first of all, welcome back to everyone skipping the story part. While not being perfect, Clair Obscur Expedition 33 is very close, and besides some minor technical issues or things like the missing map or no quest log, which I find demotivating for endgame completion, or things like the Souls-like checkpoints that I don't like, which only comes down to personal preference, Sandfall Interactive delivered a ridiculously strong debut, which, with the inclusion of elements of the Souls games, the Persona games, indie hits like Only Up, feels like a love letter to gaming history and culture. And with the entire art direction that begins with the naming after an art style that with its strong utilization of lighting is still relevant to this day, a studio of 30 passionate people managed to create something that is as close as a video game can come to the definition of art itself.